Testing, testing, testing. So, audio track for Cambodia. Duration 10 minutes. Cambodia and China, a partnership across time. For centuries, Cambodia and China have shared a dynamic relationship marked by cooperation, cultural exchange, and a strategic partnership that has evolved significantly in the modern era. From the ancient Silk Road to the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, Cambodia and China have walked a path shaped by geopolitics, economics, and shared interests. The historical ties between Cambodia and China date back to the early centuries of the Common Era. Chinese envoys visited the Khmer Empire, documenting Cambodia's rich culture, its bustling trade networks, and its rulers. These early interactions laid the foundation for mutual respect and cultural exchange. Fast forward to the 20th century in Cambodia, emerging from French colonial rule and grappling with Cold War complexities, found in China a supporter, albeit not without complications. During the tumultuous Khmer during the tumultuous Khmer Rouge period, Beijing's support for Pol Pot remains a controversial chapter in their relationship. Although that needs to be explored a little bit more, so much of the narrative that surrounds China's support of Pol Pot is taken out of context and often sort of just given as a sort of negative about China, negative about Pol Pot. Well, negative about Pol Pot is pretty simple. But China's relationship with Cambodia during that period was not as simple as just supporting Pol Pot. Of course, there was a war with Vietnam. The Americans were involved and were bombing Cambodia and bombing Laos and bombing Vietnam. Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, and Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge came out of eastern Cambodia, which is where the Ho Chi Minh Trail went from Sihanoukville all the way up to Laos. And so the Americans were bombing that. And Kissinger famously had said to Nixon that, because Nixon insisted on the bombing, and Kissinger had said to him that we do not know what the consequences of this bombing will actually be. And as it turned out, it gave a huge boost to recruitment for Khmer Rouge, for the communist forces in Cambodia. Although it later turned out that, of course, Pol Pot wasn't really putting into place any kind of China model of communism. I mean, what he was really trying to do, of course, was increase rice production, and came up with his own kind of idea of going back to year zero, literally going back to year zero and rebuilding society from the very ground up. Getting rid of all the colonial period, getting rid of all of the sort of Western thinking, capitalist thinking, liberal approach, and of course that didn't work. Disastrous, wasn't it? I mean, more than 2 million people died, which was an enormous percentage of the population. And so, yes, that's a dark period. But just to reiterate, China's support for Pol Pot was always conditional, and it was conditional mostly about the geopolitical situation with the US and Vietnam and the Vietnam War. And one needs to remember that there was 250,000 South Koreans in Vietnam as well. 250,000. I mean, that's an enormous number. That's the total number. Anyway, we've got to edit this out, so let's just keep going. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Cambodia rebuilt itself after decades of civil war, China shifted its approach, focusing on diplomacy and economic aid, with the signing of the 1993 Paris Peace Agreements, in which Australia had a large part to play. China's engagement with Cambodia entered a new phase, one centered on infrastructure, trade, and investment. Today, the relationship is at its strongest in history. Cambodia is often described as China's closest ally in Southeast Asia. This partnership is underpinned by three key pillars: economic investment, political alignment, and strategic cooperation. China is Cambodia's largest foreign investor, by far. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, billions of dollars have been funneled into Cambodian infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and hydropower projects. The Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone is a flagship example of this partnership. The Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone is a flagship example of this partnership, transforming the coastal city into a hub of Chinese commerce and tourism. Well, we're going to have a look at that a little bit later in this show, because that's not really true anymore. There's enormous difficulties with trying to, in the current situation with the Americans, really playing the bad cop here. And restricting or trying to contain China's economic growth, because that's really what it is. I mean, from the American perspective, they're looking at it as if they're, increasing as or empowering themselves, or sort of restructuralization of the American economy. That's basically what's happening. But of course, the Democrats under Biden and under Obama started lots of wars, but the risk was very low for the Americans, and they had unipolar power. But that's now gone, and the Americans no longer are able to do that. So the situation has changed once again, and of course China, the world economy, Europeans, the war in Ukraine and Gaza, Syria, tensions with the Philippines, Myanmar. I'm not going to go into great detail about what exactly the Americans are doing in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, what they're doing in East Asia with the Japanese and the Koreans, Taiwan, of course. I'm not going to go into that today, but we're going to concentrate on Cambodia. And so let's just go to the next part. On the political stage, Cambodia and China share a close alignment. Phnom Penh has often supported Beijing's position on sensitive issues, including the South China Sea dispute and Taiwan. In return, China has offered Cambodia unwavering political backing, including during periods of Western criticism over human rights and democracy. Now, of course, Cambodia does have a democratic system in place, processes in place, but like other countries in Asia, especially in Asia, it's been dominated by one man and his family and the oligarchs, what they call Okna, who basically control the economy. And this is what the Americans see as undemocratic, and in many ways it is undemocratic, but it's undemocratic in the way that the oligarchy operates in the United States is undemocratic. Why should very, very wealthy individuals own all the media and the press and control that, especially Democrats? And of course, Twitter is controlled by Elon Musk. But Cambodia's reliance on China serves both domestic and international purposes. Domestically, it strengthens Hun Sen's regime, while internationally it positions Cambodia as a gateway for China into ASEAN. Now, it's no longer Hun Sen's regime, of course. It's the regime. He's now the president of the Senate, and his son is now the prime minister. And there's been a generational change, which has not been completely smooth. The election last year was smooth. And I had the privilege of being the English editor of the official biography of Hun Sen prior to that election. I jumped at the chance, not because it was Hun Sen, but because of the opportunity to be able to be the English editor for what I consider to be an important biography. And there's been quite a few biographies of Hun Sen, but none of them are really detailed. Whereas the official biography does have an enormous amount of detail in relation to what happened during the period of his rise to power, during the Vietnam War, during the Vietnamese invasion, and his role in that, and then in his role in the peace process. And he has been able to, under the stability that he brought, has allowed Cambodia to be in the position it is now, where for the last more than 10 years now, it's had an average of about 7 to 7.5% GDP growth annually. Now, a lot of that's been Chinese money, but it's also the United States is the largest export market. So the United States is very important, and the EU as well. Now, while the Americans and the EU use their sort of import trade as leverage to basically to undermine Hun Sen's regime, to undermine the government because they want to see democratic elections. Well, what they mean by that, of course, is having an opposition party that they support. and get that into power. That's what they call democracy. But the elections were run very smoothly here last time, and it went very well, actually. But the American ambassador lost his job very quickly after that because it was successful. But the current regime under Hun Manet, the son of Hun Sen, is starting to have some problems. And they're not just problems that are internal Cambodian problems, but they're related also to China's having problems with declining growth. So it's not a shrinking economy or anything like that. Let's be real. It's still growing at 5%. And Cambodia is growing at 6%. But this has an effect on the flow of capital. And that means there's less Chinese capital available, basically. And with the Trump regime, see, there you go, the Trump regime, Trump administration, so, and his trade policies, that's created enormous problems in the Asian economies. Now, the Asian economies are all still growing, but that's been driven by China. And so, trying to throttle China's economic growth, which is what the Americans are trying to do one way or the other, any way they can, they are also limiting the growth throughout Asia, actually, which ultimately doesn't serve the Americans very well either. And so, there's a lot of discussion amongst my multipolar peace brethren, colleagues, about the fact that actually the Americans are the major cause of instability in the global economy. And of course, they could do this a whole lot better. But I think the idea of unipolarity is still there. I mean, Trump doesn't talk about multipolarity, and Biden never talked about multipolarity, and Obama doesn't talk about, he didn't talk about multipolarity either. So they still see the world as a sort of American-centric. They can't help themselves because it's been like that for more than 2 generations. So it's a kind of a given. And actually, I think more than 100 years, the US basically became the world's biggest economy in 1899. And of course, Donald Trump's hero is William McKinley, who was assassinated. And but he was, very much about protectionism and using tariffs. But then that was a very different world, and the supply chains were much shorter. And so, basically the Americans were 100% self-sufficient in many ways. And what they were doing, even then, of course, was they were interfering in other countries to support their export markets. For example, taking, Chinese cotton. Everybody thinks that the Xinjiang thing is new, but actually 100 years ago during the Open Door under Teddy Roosevelt, they were doing the same thing, trying to limit exports of cotton from China and from India so that they could build their own exports. So nothing's changed in this. Everybody thinks it's new, but actually it's not. So what else can we say about Cambodia? The economic partnership with China, however, does come with some strings, like all economic partnerships. Critics argue that Cambodia's growing dependence on Chinese loans risks creating a debt trap. Well, actually, Cambodia has very good fiscal and monetary policy, and they are far from being in a debt trap of any kind, actually. And they have very high gold reserves, they have high dollar reserves, and the debt to GDP ratio is quite low. But others point to environmental degradation and social displacement tied to Chinese products. But look, if you're going to build hydroelectricity cheaply and quickly, well, you can always say that there's going to be some kind of environmental degradation, but that hasn't stopped every country in the world doing it, including the Americans, of course. So look, this has mostly been taken out of proportion. Look, of course, there are environmental problems, water quality problems, fish, and all that sort of thing. But it's not to say that Cambodia doesn't know that and is not trying to do that. But at the same time, how to get economic growth without the provision of cheap energy, power. And water is the one thing that Cambodia has a lot of. And look, during the pandemic, Cambodia was in a drought. And so the Americans used that to say that there was a huge environmental degradation, etc., and that the Chinese were stopping water flow through their dams. But it turns out, of course, that a lot of the dams that have been built on the Mekong were built by the Thais and by the Lao and by Vietnamese. There's only 2 operating hydro plants four operating plants in Cambodia. And there was not going to be any more big ones. And so environmental degradation has been attacked. And look, the thing is that part of the Belt and Road has what's called, if anybody knows this, I don't know if everybody knows, but you have what's called, there's a ecological civilization is a Chinese conception of how the environment should be approached. And that has its roots deep in Taoism, where man is part of nature and belongs to nature, and also in Buddhism. And so that has gone right through, that remains within society. It remains a really important cultural and traditional and religious input into policy making within the CPC's ecological policy processes. Now, Xi Jinping, from early on, from when he was a young man, was exposed to this, and he's taken that and he introduced that. And I think China is the only country in the world that has ecological civilization, environmental protection built into its constitution. Now, the Green Belt and Road is being pushed since at least 2015. And that's been helping enormously. And I think it's, many people are blind to this. They don't see it. What they still see is, environmental problems. But all you have to do is walk out the door in California and you see environmental degradation everywhere. And there's lots and lots of movies about environmental degradation in American society. And just because they talk about it doesn't mean that they have the right to use it as a political tool against other countries. And Cambodia has been a victim of this. And then, of course, there's the problems with American political interference. And you see, it's one thing to have a political relationship, a partnership that China has with Cambodia. It's another thing to have one with the United States. Because with the United States, you have to fulfill not just some conditions, you have to fulfill all of the conditions, which are basically that you open your economy to American products. And so monopolies like Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Nvidia, Tesla. I mean, these are all actually monopolies. And American services, so legal system, accounting systems, FDA approval, pharmaceutical approval, flight, plane approvals. The Americans control much of the world's economy through these means, through regulation and control of these standards. Fortunately, they have not been successful with pounds, inches, and so forth, which is just a terrible system. Causes spacecraft to go out of orbit and crash in Mars, or was it Venus? And so, look, I mean, it's not as if Cambodia is just completely lost or whatever. But I will say this about Cambodia is that the new government, it's been in power now for a year, it didn't really have any teething problems. But then again, remember that the children don't get their teeth immediately. And so we can see now that because of the geopolitical problems that are being introduced into the system through the activities of the United States, its economic policies and trade policies and security policies towards China and Russia and the EU and towards competitors in the world economy like Australia and Brazil, soybeans and wheat and iron ore. America is in competition with all these countries. America is in competition for exports of commodities with Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Australia, Russia, the Ukraine, parts of the EU, parts of Africa, India, exporters of those commodities, food commodities and mineral commodities. So the US is competing with them. And of course, so these policies that are being introduced affect. They operate in two ways. They operate on a political level, in the sense that the Americans want to maintain control over being able to open and close economies. And at the same time, they want to be able to not have a monopoly, but definitely to suppress or constrain or contain their economic competitors, whether or not they fit into the American ideal alliance partnership: Japan, Germany, South Korea, the United Kingdom. And when I say those names, one just has to see that Japan has been in stagnation for more than 30 years. The UK economy is shrinking 2% this year, 2% last year. German economy is shrinking, deindustrializing, and the policies of the United States are continuing to make that happen. Now let's get to the chase. Cambodia has been of interest to Chinese companies, but it's not as interesting to Chinese companies as Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia, which are more stable and they're larger. And Cambodia is so small. So the Chinese companies are looking at Cambodia saying, well, can we re-export? Can we set up factories in Cambodia and then export around the world from Cambodia and reduce the cost, but still maintain some ownership? But of course, sanctions and tariffs are put on those as well, and I think Donald Trump is going to do that again. And so many in his second term, which will be his final term. But I think many Chinese companies are afraid that Cambodia will become a target, and that it's not. Vietnam might be safer. That America is less likely to punish Vietnam because it's a larger country, 100 million people, controls the coastline, a very long coastline, especially into the South China Sea and also up near Taiwan, and so that's a safer bet than Cambodia, which is so closely aligned with China. So at the same time, one has to remember that all these ASEAN countries are operating as a trade bloc. They're integrating fairly quickly. And I think Cambodia is very central to ASEAN, but not only geographically, but even though it's very small, also politically has an important role. And the Americans are very likely, and I think that it's very likely that Trump will probably pick on Cambodia and impose some tariffs against companies that are perceived to be Chinese proxies, or what they call shadow. But these are not really that's not what really is happening. I mean, it's not just Chinese-owned Chinese companies. There are other companies that have set up in China over many, many years, and I know some of the CEOs of these companies, or even the owners of these companies, and they're foreign-owned, but they run in China, and so for manufacturing. And so they also want to diversify, and some of them have diversified, as I said, into Vietnam and Thailand. And part of my job has been trying to get them to diversify into Cambodia. But there's a lot of resistance. Now, there have been, FDI into Cambodia, everybody's singing the praises. It's been quite high this year. But not all that money has come from China by any stretch of the imagination, although a lot of it still is. But you can also see that a percentage of these companies are also leaving Cambodia. They've had a bad experience here. And this is one of the things that I really want to talk about today, is the fact that the way the system is set up in Cambodia, the political system, with having one very strong leader for such a long time, has meant that there's a sort of, what shall we call that, petrification of the hierarchy. And so it makes it very, very difficult for people, for deputy governors who are in charge of FDI, for example, to go out and get money and investment. They always need to be putting that up, and everything eventually heads onto the desk of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's father, the former Prime Minister. And along the way, there's lots of middle-level cadres, undersecretaries, secretaries, deputy ministers, and there's a lot of those, who, shall we say, always seeking consideration for their role in opening the door to more investment, which of course, if you have less money to invest, generally speaking, less capital, then you don't want to be having to pay extra on top, 10%, 20%, just to make sure you can get the deal done. The deal, can't sit on its own merits. There has to be consideration for every step along the way in the hierarchy, otherwise known as corruption. So that is institutionalized in Cambodia. Now, but it's also very quiet. I mean, nobody really talks about it, but it happens, and it happens a lot. Now, it's also institutionalized in other countries, but in different ways. Here, because it's such a small country, it's so easy to see it. Whereas, institutionalized corruption, PAC funds in America, for example, that's institutionalized corruption. Private concerns being able to pump endless amounts of money into a political party is not a good thing. And so the same thing happening in Cambodia, of course, is seen as not democratic and massive corruption, etc. Well, yes, it's easier to see, and as a percentage of the total economy, it's bigger, definitely. But for example, Italy has run the black economy. It's still famously running, and people consider that the black economy in Italy is still something like 30% of the total economy, and that's not registered. So a lot of that is not registered. So one has to put this into some kind of a perspective. However, Cambodia does have this problem, and I think it's becoming a critical problem in relation to the new government, because they have gone out and said many times, and I've been in meetings and I've had meetings with very high level officials who have stated that this is not acceptable, it's not going to happen, but it does, and by the very people that tell you that it's not going to happen. That worries me. And every time I see somebody shaking the hand of the Prime Minister, it's almost certainly, a businessman I mean, or businesswoman, it's almost certainly that either it's critical, or more often than not, that there's been consideration of some sort. Now, while this happens everywhere, and there's so many scandals, French companies, selling Mirage jets to India, oil pipelines, American oil companies in Saudi Arabia, there are so many examples of this. I think Airbus got into trouble, Boeing's been in trouble doing this kind of thing. It's not as if this is new. But the point here is, in Cambodia, it's so small that you can see it very easily. And it's very, very difficult. And with an economy this size, somebody wants to invest $1 billion, you're going to lose a fifth of that money. $200 million is going to disappear somewhere. And that only reinforces the power of the oligarchy. And of course, there's that too. So the oligarchs control essential parts of the economy: telecommunications, television, radio, media, energy production, food processing, transport, forestry, fishing, many parts of the economy are controlled by oligarchs, especially in relation to agricultural products, where the trading of agricultural products is controlled usually by just one person in each town or village. And this is still done in a very old, there's no record of how this is done. You want to see some records about, who paid whom for what, and where did it go afterwards. And so the enormous amount of trade that Cambodia has with Vietnam is often the fact that the Vietnamese also control a large percentage of the Cambodian economy, and they want to keep it that way. And that's why there's been furor over the new canal that the government has been pushing for, so that it allows them to avoid having to transport and sell everything into Vietnam so that it can be exported. So now they've got their own direct access to the sea. But this has caused a problem with China and Vietnam. So Vietnam's unhappy about it, and so they've, of course, complained to China about that. And now, China and Vietnam have sort of got a rapprochement, and they're building rail, integrating Vietnam's rail network into the Southeast Asian rail network, and this with Chinese money. Vietnam has narrow gauge rail. It's not the standard gauge rail that China uses for Belt and Road, which is much better, of course, the narrow gauge. But because Cambodia is, hill, the mountains and the sea, it's very, very narrow, 90 kilometers wide at some points. So narrow track, narrow gauge rail was a better choice originally. But look, it's not now. But so there's some special considerations in that deal. But what I'm trying to say here is that Vietnam wants to maintain some kind of control over Cambodia's economy. Now, Thailand also has this. So Cambodia is basically between Thailand and Vietnam. Laos is quite small, and it doesn't have a large impact on the Cambodian economy. Malaysia's impact on Cambodia's economy is growing, but it's quite soft compared to, say, Vietnam. And then, of course, there is still within Cambodian society a lot of resentment against Vietnam. But it's wrong to think that that's purely about the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam, or that it's related to Hun Sen and his backing. He was backed by the Vietnamese to get rid of Pol Pot. And the Chinese, of course, were very unhappy about this, expanding power of Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam has been expansionary. It's grown enormously. It was always much, much smaller. 150 years ago, there was no Vietnam. There was just Viet. And it was only in the north. It was the French that changed the maps, and they took half of the Khmer Empire and they gave it to the Viet, and that became Vietnam, Viet South. And it controls the estuary of the river, of the Mekong. And so, of course, it made Cambodia dependent on Vietnam. So, and of course, dependent on France. So that one has to remember that it's colonialism and imperialism has created these situations. Now, how to unravel all of that? Well, Cambodia has signed peace treaties and border treaties with all of its neighbours, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos. And there's enormous amounts of agreements over the Mekong and cooperation agreements. But of course, the Americans have come in with their Mekong, and they have a lot of them, not just one. They have friendship, friends of Mekong, but it doesn't include China. And of course, half the Mekong is in China. Everybody forgets that. And so the most important partner you can have for Mekong, for environment and for everything else, is going to be China. And the Americans try to exclude China from that, and then they basically try to leverage the Thais and the Vietnamese and Myanmar and Laos to put pressure on China. It's really not helpful to Cambodia at all. Now, that's not to say that there isn't useful scientific academic work that happens, and through multilateral agencies, so of course the United Nations, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, IMF. But for example, Sihanoukville, one of the reasons Sihanoukville has had so much trouble with the pandemic, and there was a huge boom in 2015 to 2019, one of the problems in Sihanoukville is that none of the US-controlled development banks, so IMF and World Bank basically, want to put any money into Sihanoukville, because they see Sihanoukville in terms of geopolitical power and the Gulf of Thailand and access into the South China Sea. So the Americans do not have a port in the Gulf of Thailand. And so the Ream Naval Base, which is next to Sihanoukville, which is the largest port, and that's by no means unusual to have naval installation right next to your major port. That's totally normal. Just look at San Diego, for example. That's one of the largest ports in America, and right next door you've got the naval base. This is very, very normal. Same is true of Toulon in France, Marseille in France. Look, any port, any major port you can think of has got some kind of naval installation right next to it, because you know what the old saying is, that the flag follows trade, and so yeah, you need to be able to protect your sea lines of communication and your shipborne trade. But so much trade these days is not really in these large ocean-going container vessels or transporters. They're very, very big, but they don't really go into these smaller Asian ports. They go into Singapore, or they go into Busan in Korea, and then they're put into the smaller coastal vessels, which are 30,000 tons or less. And of course, in the Gulf of Thailand, they're quite small, actually. And then you get to river transport, or estuary transport and river transport, and they get down to 1,000 tons, which makes it difficult to electrify, actually, because the batteries are going to be too heavy for that size ship. But for coastal vessels at 20,000 tons, 10,000 tons, even 30,000 tons, electrification is fantastic. And on very large rivers, also, if the barges are large enough, then it makes sense too. So that's one of the things that needs to be done in Cambodia. And actually, that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about, and that is that I've been very closely involved with the development of two master plans. One master plan that Belt and Road Capital Partners is an investment company, and I'm the chairman of that company, and we have looked at electrifying the river ports in Cambodia, and politically that's been very, very difficult because the supply chains, energy supply chains, petrol, diesel supply chains, those are very, very long, well-established supply chains, and there's resistance to any change, although it's going to happen anyway. We all know it's going to happen. Electric cars and so forth. And if you go to the airport now, on the way in Phnom Penh, you go out to the airport, there's nothing but electric. All the car sales yards are there, and there's 50 or 100 of them. They're all turning electric. I mean, literally, in the last 2 years, I think 4 years ago there was one, and now there's, I don't know, more than half of them are easily electric now. So this tells you that what's happening, although motorbikes is a different story, and that's because Honda basically dominates the market here for petrol-powered scooters and motorbikes. And so they don't want to give that up. And so they have done everything they can to stop the introduction of electric bikes, although it is happening. And it is happening, it's a trickle, but it's going to become a flood, just like the cars have now become a flood. So I think that's going to change fairly rapidly. But the point being that trying to get the government to invest in electrification of, so solar power is being installed fairly regularly, solar farms and so forth. But the government's restricted how much of that can be, any major project that's built is only allowed to have 40% solar, okay. But that problem can be solved if you have storage. But the government has not been supporting solar farms with storage, or for example, the new ports on the rivers that are going to open up the hinterland to agricultural and mining export and processing and so forth. Those ports need power, and so they either have to come from the grid or they have to be done with solar. And there's been real problems in getting them to be able to transfer to solar, and because it needs to come with storage, but the government wants you to plug directly into the grid and not put up the storage. So this is really short-sighted. There's a great opportunity here to put in power around these 7 ports and to build storage around them. And that means that the area around those ports, where they're going to build processing and obviously transport, manufacture That sort of thing is going to boom if there's persistent, uninterrupted power supply, which only battery storage would allow to happen. The grid is reliable. I mean, Phnom Penh is very reliable. We don't lose. I think we've only lost power in the 4 years that I've been here. We've lost power twice, and it was never more than an hour. So, or maybe it was 2 hours once. So, and that wasn't because the whole system failed. That was because they closed it down to upgrade it or something. But all I'm trying to say here is that the transition. So what the new technocratic, new generation government, the sons of the oligarchs and daughters of the oligarchs, are doing is that, they're technocrats, and yes, they've been to university, and many of them have been to university overseas, but many have not. Many have been to just universities here, and maybe maybe they're not so highly educated actually, and they have lots of advisors, but they're not really following that advice. And while there's lots of opportunities still here, low cost and so forth, the money is still going into shorter term construction of manufacturing or processing and things like that. There's sort of distributed networks. This is what Cambodia is ideal for distributed networks. You have this main river, which is like just a huge superhighway down the center of the country. It provides enormous opportunity for cheap transport, besides all of the other things that it does, like water and fish and the environment, keeping everything running. It's the mother, it gives life to the whole country. But it's also very efficient in terms of transport. So building these 7 ports and opening the hinterland, you would think, is sort of very, very important to get done as fast as possible. But there is real reticence to do it, and that's, I think, slowing growth here a lot, because that then feeds into the ports. So Phnom Penh port, the land port, the river port, the sea ports, to Vietnam, to Thailand, and out into the south, out into the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, across to Thailand, across to Malaysia, and into Vietnam, for example. That is being held back because they're looking for extensions to the garment industry, where that's demand is dropping. So that means that there has to be added value, or they have to reduce input costs. And reducing input costs, for example, means providing electricity that's not provided by coal. There's one plant that does that, or oil or gas. Now, Cambodia has no refining capacity whatsoever, so all oil is imported. So it would make real sense to go straight to batteries, storage, and solar, which is by far the cheapest power. And then the input costs are much less. And Cambodia could get there much, much faster if it wanted to do that, because there is no shortage of Chinese companies, for example, and other companies. Australian companies have invested in solar here, but they've just hooked up directly to the grid. And they haven't provided storage, so it's not stable power. So that is a real problem, and it could instantly kind of really get these ports operating much faster. So that's look, it's not as if the government has to come up with the money. All the government has to do, and so this is where you get into this sort of oligarchical and ministries or institutional tension, where one ministry doesn't really want to cooperate with another ministry, and you might have to work with 3 or 4. And then, so if you're the company that's investing, that's going to cost you this consideration is now ×4. And not only is it ×4, then those ministries have to work together, and so they are very slow. Nobody can make a decision, because the decision eventually just goes all the way to the Prime Minister's office or to his father's office. And so that has become a real problem in this country. And it's holding this country back. Now, meanwhile, there is definitely fiscal responsibility and monetary policy responsibility. The currency remains pegged to the US dollar because it's the largest export market, and it stabilizes the economy, and that's fine. De-dollarization is happening, dollar notes were taken out, and then $5 notes, and then $10 notes, and basically $20 notes are gone as well. And the best you can do these days is basically $100. But your average Cambodian never has $100 in his pocket. And anyway, everybody uses their phone to pay for everything. So so the government has been pushing everybody into local currency bank accounts instead of dollar bank accounts. And so it's going to happen. It's pretty obvious. And within the ASEAN integration, there's the integration of local currency, and then there's the Chinese and BRICS also pushing towards or de-dollarization, if you like. That's a real trend. It's happening. It seems to be glacial, but actually, as you look back, you see that over a period of a year or two, it's really been quite rapid. So I think the de-dollarization will be completed within the next 5 years for sure. But Donald Trump's policies are going to be don't de-dollarize. And he said that, and he's going to punish people who do de-dollarize. So that's another thing that might punish Cambodia. I'm just going to call it quits there for a moment and see if this sound quality is worthwhile.